Hello, and welcome to the Salesforce Developers Ask Me Anything, when we are going to be talking about Apex updates and innovations with two amazing guests. Before we start, make sure to don't make any financial decision based on the things you are going to see today. We are going to be showcasing things that are not generally available, so only invest on things that are generally available. And before we start, also remember to join the Salesforce developer group in the Trailblazer community. Go ahead, scan this QR code, join the group, and here we can follow up after this episode. You can ask more questions and you can keep in touch with all of the community that it's around the Salesforce developers. We are going to be receiving questions from the YouTube chat and the LinkedIn chat. So make sure to have all of the questions for the experts we have for you today. It is my honor to introduce the following folks that are joining this AMA. Here we have Daniel Ballinger. He is the product manager director for Apex. Hello, Daniel. How you doing?
Hello, great, thank you. I'm looking forward to talking to everyone today about Apex and the new features we've got coming.
Of course, welcome. And we also have another Apex expert, which is Mohit Srivastava.
Hey
He's a
everyone.
lead developer advocate for Salesforce. Hello, Mo.
Hey Julian, thank you for the invite and thanks everyone for joining today.
Of course. So I'm very happy to be hosting this special AMA. And Daniel, what do you have to show us to give us a little bit more about the context of what's coming for Apex before we start with the questions?
All right, I'll switch over to my slides because I've brought some things that we presented at Dreamforce and I thought they'd be quite useful to walk through, sort of give you an indication of the direction we're going. I'm assuming everyone can see the slides. One area that we're looking at introducing 24 is the ability to evaluate formulas directly in Apex without having to have a backing formula field on an S object. That's a really powerful concept because you can define and modify the formula in code at runtime to suit the particular needs. And one of the reasons it's particularly useful for Apex developers is you'll often find a needs to create something like a rules engine or something, where you'll need to have a formula syntax of your own to evaluate should something happen, should it not happen, like is this a conditional framework trigger, should this record be processed, what are the validation rules that should happen on this particular record. And by us giving you our existing formula engine, it means admins can work in a syntax they're familiar with. You don't need to invent your own language or your own rules engine to evaluate that. You can use something that people are already familiar with to execute on those features. We'd love to hear more ideas about like other uses people would have for formulas in Apex. One of the reasons this is quite a useful idea is you don't need to dedicate a field on an object to evaluate that formula. And another nice benefit of it is it doesn't evaluate against just S objects. It can also evaluate against Apex objects, which is quite a powerful addition. You'll need, currently with the dev preview, you'll need to opt in like with global fields and global objects to evaluate, global properties on global objects to evaluate them. So it's very selective about what you can access, but it does open up a lot of powerful evaluation options with those formulas. I'll give you an idea of what that might look like. So in a very basic sense, like say you wanted to evaluate a formula against an account object, here you can see we've got a very simple is blank on the site field in account. And in the dev preview, there's two stages to using the formula in Apex. The first is this sort of builder syntax we've got, where you tell it, I'm going to make a formula, it's going to return a Boolean, it's working against the account S object, here's the formula and build it. That building step is quite important because it will validate that the formula syntax is correct, that the object that you're binding against has the correct fields or properties to evaluate that formula. And then it gives you a single instance of that formula. And because you've done that validation step once, then you can then evaluate it multiple times against different account S objects. So you could do that once and then run it in a loop just to keep evaluating against each account without having to redo that validation step. That's a very sort of basic example. Of course, it gets more advanced. Here's a sort of similar one, except we're no longer working against an S object. Instead, we're working against a global object defined in Apex. So it can have properties. Those properties have getters and setters as normal. And then same steps again, you build up a formula instance with the parameters. In this case, we're going to actually return a date time. And then after you've validated and built that formula, you can run it against individual S objects and get the result of that formula. And that's really useful. You don't have to go to the database. There's no SOQL required to get the evaluation. You don't need to use your SOQL query limits to evaluate that formula. One of the key goals of this is that you don't have to go to the database. You don't have to use those limits. It's all at runtime in memory. I'll switch to another feature that we've got coming. This is not quite a dev preview in the next spring 24 release, probably looking more for something around the summer 24 timeline. This is the concept of adding a cursor to Apex. So this is for scenarios where you might have a SOQL query that's going to return more results than you can process in one transaction. Historically, if you wanted to do something like that, you would have either had to pass it off to a batch job, or you would have had to do some sort of primary key chunking on the SOQL query, so to work through those records yourself. Because there's an inherent limit to how many records you can work through in one result set when the offset is used, because you can only otherwise get to about 2,000 records. The concept of a cursor actually gives you a lot more flexibility over that, especially when combined with something like queuables. Basically, it's a SOQL query result that's serializable, and it maintains a reference to the result set. And then, so you can see like here, you'd run your SOQL query, get that cursor back, store the serializable version, say here in a queuable, and then when you execute that queuable instance, that cursor is available and you can fetch a subset of results from that SOQL query, process them however you need in your queuable. And then if there's still more records to be processed, so like say you haven't actually tracked the position, like the cursor is stateless, so you have to keep track of the position yourself. But once you've got to the end of the results, or while there's still more results, you can just keep enqueuing more queuables to process through it. There's other powerful ideas here. It's obviously not just for queuables. It's also really useful for a number of scenarios such as pagination. Again, you've got a large result set and you want the user to be able to page through it in the UI. With this, you could serialize the cursor back to the client and then send it back and then jump back and forwards between pages. Because it is stateless, you could jump to the last page, the first page, and you can define like how many records you want to get back in each page. So it's a lot of flexibility there that you wouldn't have previously had without trying to do some fairly complicated like binding or pagination yourself through the primary key chunking or something similar and defining the sort orders. Finally, I thought I might just bring up the general roadmap to give people a larger idea of what we've coming and what we released recently. Winter 24, we had data weave in Apex, very good, powerful feature if you need to read, transform, and write data between different formats. Opens up a lot of possibilities for things like CSV parsing in Apex, which would have previously been possible but had sharp edges. This actually smoothed a lot of those transformation use cases out. We have our ongoing user mode database operations with permission sets dev preview. We're still looking for feedback on that. Areas where it allow you to have more flexibility between a full user mode and system mode in a transaction. We have a number of enhancements we're doing to queuables around deduplication and depth control. So you can control how far queuables run in the depth recursion. And there's also the ability to dedupe requests on the inbound request to help save your limit consumption rather than processing the same record again and again. Some other things we've got, another exciting one in Spring 24 is a dev preview of zip support in Apex. This is for processing smaller zip files, but it opens up possibilities to extract the data out of them from the zip or to write a small zip file. Still runs within your heap and CPU limits, but I know people are doing that sort of operation, so it's good to have like a native platform support for that. What else have we got coming? So we have some nice developer quality of life things like a null coalescing operator to complement the safe navigation operator, have a dedicated UUID support class. I always think of it as GUID because I came from a .NET background, but like a unique identifier class for generating and parsing those. Yeah, I think that's and then further forward, longer term, we've got rollout of those features. We've got like the dev preview of formula eval and the cursors enhancements. That's on the longer term roadmap. So I rushed through a lot of that. Maybe we have some questions. It might be a good time to see where we're at with those questions.
For sure, and you are right. We have some questions that are coming from both chats, YouTube and LinkedIn. And if you are just tuning in, please go ahead and interact with us, ask questions to these two experts about Apex. The first question that we have is from Niket, and it's coming from the YouTube channel. Why streams are not available in Apex like Java? Always have to use unnecessary boilerplate code every time.
So you're thinking like you want to be able to process a file part by part. Like obviously a stream, you'd read some of the stream in. Part of it's the transaction model. You would have to be able to process the entire stream within the transaction, that you couldn't maintain it longer term. I don't have other particular reasons why we don't have stream support. I don't know, Mo, you have any other?
I think one of the reasons why they would probably want streams is all these AI apps building require chunking the data into vectors. Maybe they want to process those as streams. So that could be one of the reasons why I think community might be interested in these kind of features. But I think something for us to take back from here and discuss.
Certainly, yeah. Like I think there probably is actually an idea exchange idea on already for streaming support in Apex. If you want to add your specific use cases to that, it's always helpful. I do look at those every release. We're looking at what things we can pull from the idea exchange to bring in as new features for developers. Having the primary use cases you need them for there, it makes it a whole lot easier to justify adding those sorts of features. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good one. We have another one here regarding formulas. This is coming from Ivan on YouTube. Will formula evaluation will be subject to the same limits as formula fields?
Generally, yes. It depends on which specific formula field limit you're thinking of. But yes, it would have to work within the Apex transaction limits. Because the formulas are evaluated within memory, they can work on whatever data state you've loaded into the system. So I know obviously that sometimes the limitation of a formula field is if you have to go across so many objects, it can't reach across a large volume of objects. Whereas Apex will be able to evaluate against anything that's got in memory. But the general goal is to use the native formula syntax support. So if you couldn't define it in a formula, you won't be able to use it in Apex either. There are flexibilities because you can evaluate against an Apex object model. You might be able to have Apex overcome some of those limitations on, like, say, object dependency graphs. Like, you might be able to reach further through an Apex, expose that as a property, and then evaluate against that. So there is a lot of flexibility there. So it really depends on which specific limit you're against or you're working to.
Awesome. More about formulas. It's a very interesting topic right now. Um, we have here from LinkedIn, but I'm not getting the name of the person. He's anonymous, or they are anonymous. As long as we are talking about formulas, I discovered today that at least in Visual Force, if we evaluate the character 12, it returns the string backslash t rather than an actual line feed character. So is this a feature or a bug?
Is /t line feed or tab? I thought
Yeah,
carriage return line feed is /r/n, isn't it? But I get what you're saying, that obviously the encoding's a bit different. I don't know specifically. I would have to take that back to the Formula Engine team. Um,
yeah,
we'll
you
get
can
notes on this
always
question.
follow up on the Trailblazer community group if this is an error you are facing in your application. And another one from formulas that we have here. Let me check. Why do I really need the formulas in Apex? Can I just use Apex code to write the formula conditions instead? How are formulas better?
So part of yes, you can express anything in a formula in Apex code. The reason that formulas in Apex are useful is it's usually for sort of a more configuration style scenario. You might imagine an admin or a business user needs to define criteria where some rule should evaluate, like, should I process this record now? Especially as an ISV, those business rules might not be known at the time you're making your package. You'll need the company that installed the package to define the rules. So you can't define it in your code. You could have them define Apex code that you then call, but in many cases, they're actually more comfortable defining formulas. So this is really powerful. It means they can define a formula in a language format that they're familiar with. It's probably a little more accessible. And then your Apex code can evaluate that on their behalf against the objects and the properties that you choose to expose to it. So it's a
Yeah,
lot more
yeah.
flexibility, a lot more working in the language they're familiar with.
Yeah, I would also like to add that from my experience working as an ISV developer, we always have this requirement where, we want to create screens, like for example, let's say you're creating a mapping interface so that you're able to map some objects, right? As a part of that, you always need some kind of a formula, some kind of ability, so end users can put their formula, and then we evaluate those formulas on fly during the application runtime. So I think this is a great feature if it comes out for all the ISVs out there, because that means they will be able to create solutions more flexible, offer kind of more templates, I would say, to end users. So end users for ISV apps are usually administrators. So as a developer, right, you basically make your app more flexible. So something to add on there.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Switching to a different topic. This is coming from LinkedIn. What about child subquery cursors? Will there be an allowance for that?
Currently in the dev preview, like, subqueries won't be supported. This will be very similar to what you have like with a batch job, where the batch job can't have a subquery defined in the SOQL query. Part of the reason for that is basically the way we store the query results. We want the top level query to basically say, this is a list of records that we're going to process. Like, there could be many millions of results, and bringing that out to the subqueries doesn't really scale. So as with batch, the general idea for cursors is that you would run your top level query, and then when you pull the records out, you would then evaluate a subquery as needed to pull the child records. And it is a good question. It is definitely something we have to address in the design of that feature, to make it scale out to so many records. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. We have another question. This is coming from LinkedIn, asked by Jefferson Chavez. Are there plans to bring Lambda functions into Apex?
Not in the immediate short term, although it is something we have discussed. It sort of fits into a larger long-term roadmap area around first thinking about how we're going to structure generics in Apex, and then because that would help inform the way the lambdas are evaluated against them. Because obviously you'd often want to put like a sort of a more generic implementation into your lambdas to do the typing. So it is something we've considered. We have some rough proof of concepts, but it's not in the immediate roadmap until we figure out the path for generics.
Okay. Thank you very much. Another one from LinkedIn. This is from Eric. I would like to see more support for the stub API. Example, support for inner class object stubbing.
That is actually an area we've been exploring recently. Maybe not specifically inner class stubbing, but looking at other areas of the system that need stubbing support to support various test scenarios. Eric, I mean, if you want to expand, I know we're on the idea exchange, your specific needs for inner classes. It would always be useful to have those use cases built out. We've been looking in recent discussions around some specific subset of system methods that might make sense to stub out. There's also interesting questions around stubbing of static methods. That's an interesting one, but probably not for customer code. Probably the thought would be that the statics you'd need to work around through other methods. Inner class is the one we could look at. I think there's some complications there to do with the representation of those classes. But yeah, certainly if you want to give us the use cases, we can explore those further.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I would like to add up here is I think one of the common, at least common challenge that I face is, especially when I have like connect API classes. Like for example, these days, there was a named credential class that got created, but we couldn't find any, ways to like do testing for it. So the only way we accomplished was using the stub API. So Daniel, this is something that we as as developers also face. This is like there are a bunch of, like you said, static classes, system classes. So I think if there are more mocks available using this stub API framework internally, that would actually help us a lot as developers, saving a lot of time having to go ahead and stub all these classes and create mock APIs.
Yeah.
Thank you
Good
very
use case.
much. Let's continue. This is also coming from YouTube by Diafray Quadros. I hope I pronounced your name well. If not, pardon me. Could you share more information about generics in
Okay,
Apex?
so yeah, I'm well aware like generics has been on the idea exchange for a long time for Apex. It's a very popular requested feature. We have, and I know I've had it on the roadmap for a while, we have actually been doing a lot of internal investigation around what we can do for generic support in Apex. It's an interesting problem because Apex obviously has a long history of like more than a decade of code out there existing. And there's various parts of the system where we do um, what's called reified generics, which is basically where the code at runtime, code maintains in its compiled state knowledge of what the type is. So you will see that in a lot of your collection classes, your lists, your sets, your maps, they'll actually maintain when they're compiled to bytecode knowledge of what type it was compiled against. In other places of the system, we do what's called sort of type erasure, which is more close to a. Let me know if I'm getting too technical or too in depth.
Please go ahead
um,
and be technical. This is what we like.
it's been a long discussion, and we've been working on this for a while and exploring a lot of the possibilities. Like we could do an hour-long talk on this easily. So in other cases of the system, we do what's called sort of type erasure, which is where when the code is compiled, we actually don't keep track of what type it was of that generic. And that sort of creates a lot of sort of sharp edges in the language where if we were to try and define a path forward which says we will strictly be either type safe or type erased, then there's a conflict with all your existing code. As a product manager, like one of our key parts of Apex is like it's stable, it keeps running. Like you can define your code, define the API version, and then it'll just run for pretty much ever. You don't need to come back to it. If we choose a particular path, it might create this conflict where your existing code will no longer be compatible with the new code. That could be quite a hurdle for people if they have to update all their Apex code. That's a very heavy uplift. There's other problems where, if your code is no longer compatible with what it used to be, or if we have to redefine a new specific collection system, like draw a line in the sand and say, you have to migrate from this to make it work with the new generics. There's quite a heavy uplift there. And then there's also the specifics of what use cases are you trying to solve with generics. Like I'm aware of a lot of them. There's ones around trigger frameworks. There's ones around creating mock data for test classes. There's scenarios around working with the collections, all the repeated code you have maybe say for unpacking a map. There's a lot of areas to explore there and about the way the solution for generics in Apex would best fit for that. The most useful thing people can do now for us is, I think there's a Trailblazer community group for generics in Apex, is to put their scenarios in there to make sure that when we're considering how we go forward with this, that we actually choose a solution that will work for that. There's a reason this idea has been on the Idea Exchange for so long. There's no easy solution that's not going to cause a lot of friction with the existing type system, but we also want to make sure it solves the problems that people have. So we have been giving it a lot of thought, and we continue to do so.
Well, thank you very much. Let's continue. This is coming from YouTube by Andra. Could you modify existing formulas set up in the object manager via code? But how will that be possible regarding order of execution? Could you modify formulas that are in the object manager via code?
In my mind, that's a sort of question of, can I modify metadata about the org through Apex code? It's sort of this area that we have to be sort of careful with, because then you're sort of in the realm of code modifying the state of the system. Well, I mean, obviously it modifies the state of the data, but if you start to get into code that can modify code, or code that can modify something that an admin's configured, that's usually an area we steer away from. There is the metadata API exposed in Apex, but it has a defined set of things that you can and can't work against. So the formula work we're doing in Apex is not really about touching anything that admin has configured. It's more about using what the admin's configured, or having them define a formula for us, not Apex going in and modifying the formulas for them.
Yeah, and I would suggest that for this scenario where you want to keep it, again, modifying, as Daniel said, modifying something that had been set up is not a great idea, for the system stability. But if you need something which needs to be modified, like dynamic, maybe explore using custom metadata, where you can put some kind of templates at this point. Obviously, I think once the formula builder Apex classes come, maybe there are better ways to do that. But I think if you need the code where you need the flexibility to modify certain formulas, then I think exploring that custom metadata types would be better than thinking about writing some APIs or something to directly modify formulas configured by admins.
Thank you very much, Mo and Daniel. Let's continue. This is another question coming from YouTube from DFRA. When working on a repo with multiple folders, you can clash names. Sometimes we need to use a prefix or suffix to avoid that. Are you planning to have some kind of Java packaging or namespace support?
It's the tricky one because, it fits more into the sort of developer experience product tooling around, and it also fits into packaging. So it actually spans a number of product areas in Salesforce. As far as I'm aware, there's no immediate plans for sort of namespaces within a package. Well, namespaces within a package kind of translates to namespaces within a namespace because the package is the namespace. Um, the shorter answer is no, there's no immediate plan for that. Again, Idea Exchange or Trailblazer community feedback are great for those sorts of scenarios. I mean, like I'm familiar with other languages where you had namespaces within your unit of packaging, and you could divide it
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, and you can always use 2GP 2GP unlocked namespace packages with just Apex classes in them. I mean, you can have like multiple packages too if you want, these kind of capabilities. Like have a package for, let's say, your base Apex classes, so that it gets a namespace. You can have like unlocked namespace packages only for Apex classes if you need to, and they behave, in my experience, they behave well and keep the system stable. So only problem that I see is sometimes what I see community doing is like creating X amount of packages. Like the more number of packages you create, that also becomes a kind of a challenge from an architectural perspective. So I think the key here is to balance between the number of packages you have in your org, and also the amount of modularity that you want to achieve. So I'm pretty sure if the dev free, right, if he's aware of packaging at all in Salesforce, or you know or this was a question more from someone knowing packaging. So just want to put it out there that there is 2GP unlocked namespace packages too, if you want to go that route.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mo. And then let's continue with the next question from YouTube from Manoj. We get depth error while creating a formula field if that object is already used as lookup in current object. How to solve this? Currently, we create non-formula field and populates data using flow.
I mean, it's a tricky one because, again, it comes back to the formula engine itself. I, what I can say is that formula evaluation in Apex gives you another option there. Rather than you evaluating it in Flow, you could evaluate it in formula in Apex and then store the result in a field. It's sort of similar to what you would do with Flow. But the advantage of Apex here is that you could still use the same formula syntax with the dev preview to get the similar result.
All right. I have a follow-up question here for you, Daniel. So I think Manoj is asking, okay, there are times where we hit this depth exception because it's referencing, let's say, multiple, levels of parent objects, up the ladder, right? So will those kind of limitations will be there when this, formula builder Apex class, or system class is available to us?
So the key part of formula evaluation in Apex is it works on the in-memory representation. So if you
Okay.
can represent that data structure in memory, then we can evaluate against it. So
Got it.
I want to say it won't have those limitations. I'd have to check the specifics. Like obviously we're talking about S objects here. We'd have to check the specifics of where that limit is being enforced. But as a general principle, if you can store it in memory in Apex, then you can evaluate against it.
All right, got it.
So,
All right. So I think this would be a good way for this problem to go away, probably, when the formula fields in Apex arrive, because then you can take some formulas out from your formula fields and distribute it to Apex, so that way you're not hitting the depth limit, sort of.
yeah. Thank you very much. We don't have a question. We just have a comment that I want to share from Jeffrey. Formula evaluation as an ISV provider is a big deal. So thank you very much for working on delivering this feature.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, yeah, if there's any specific features you need in it, we're always looking for feedback on that. Make sure we're covering those use cases if we haven't already. That's part of why we're bringing it out as a dev preview. Let everybody give it a try, get your feedback. We'll refine it and get it just the way you need it.
Okay, thank you. Now this question is coming from LinkedIn from Rajesh. Hello, can we validate XLS file attachment using Apex? I know we can do that with a CSV file.
We can't currently do that today with DataWeave and Apex. I know DataWeave does support Excel files. One of the challenges we looked at this use case. One of the challenges we ran into was the way DataWeave did it was it needed to work with the Excel file on the disk, which is not something that scales in a cloud computing world. We need to work in memory, which is why the support's not there. So the short answer is no, we can't do that today. It is something we'd have to explore. We'd have to work with the MuleSoft team on how we represent Excel files in DataWeave and the libraries that need to be loaded in to do that. But the short answer is no, not today, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Another question from LinkedIn. This is Peter. What about the ability to have run as outside of test classes? For example, in production code. The only way you can change the user currently is with platform events.
That's a very tricky one from a security perspective and auditing, because who the code runs as obviously enforces the security model and it populates all the auditing fields. The general idea is that no, we won't support that because it opens up all sorts of very complex scenarios where maintaining the correct security model is really not possible. We want to make assurances that the code ran as this user. We checked what it did. If you switch user mid-transaction, that is a much more tricky scenario.
Yeah, I think the dev preview feature is interesting. I mean, it can sort of do this right with the dev preview feature that you have with permission sets. Is like maybe you configure certain permission sets and then basically run as that permission set. So almost, I mean, you're not truly running as that user though, but you still can ensure that okay, it's running with specific permission sets at least.
Yeah, that's a much more like that's a scenario where we can still audit and say, okay, you ran as this user and you clearly ran with this additional permission set that the admin configured, the developer used. We can audit it. We can say the security model that you wanted was enforced, and it's a much better fit for that sort of type of scenario.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's continue from another question from LinkedIn. How can we control platform events delivery in the utility bar components and multiple users using the utility bar?
Oh, this I don't think this is related to Apex at all. This is more related to, I would say, Lightning web components and platform events. So maybe we can park this and then follow up on Trailblazer community. Yeah, so I think this is basically related to LWCs and platform events. There's no Apex involvement here.
Okay, perfect. We have another off topic, but it touches Apex a little bit. This is from Fahad on YouTube. Is the general practice to pass the data from Apex to LWC, which will pass it back to Apex, like displaying data from integration from Apex to LWC and LWC to Apex to save it?
Yeah, so this is a great question actually. Like there is no general, I would say not a general best practice or anything like that, right? One thing you get with Apex that I like so much about Apex is where the Fahad is saying that it is more of an integration use case, right? The security, because sales like the Apex executes on the server, right? So you can basically have name credentials configured and then have Apex class reach out to the external service. So I think then that becomes a kind of a a better approach than having your LWC directly call that service, because then you're calling from the client side, and if you're putting some kind of let's say a secret or something exposed on your client side, that could be a security vulnerability there. So if you are dealing with integrations, I would say yes, that makes a lot of sense to use Apex there to reach to your service, and then whatever the data flow that you described is, like LWC calling Apex and the Apex calling the integration service and then pass back the data to LWC makes a lot of sense. But if you're just talking about, like, let's say, you know operations within Salesforce, like querying a bunch of records, there's also, like, you can do this multiple ways. There are multiple wire adapters that are available now, GraphQL adapters. So it truly depends on what you're trying to use. If there is like these adapters, those have also like all these security features baked into it. Like, for example, GraphQL wire adapter has caching, field level security baked into it, the record access baked into it. So I would probably use that for use cases where I'm just dealing with Salesforce data, right? But if I had to reach out to an external service outside Salesforce, and if I'm using Apex, then this thing makes more sense.
Okay. Thank you very much. Another question. This is from Ivan on YouTube. Kind of a historical question. What is the reason for removing interface generics after API version 24?
Okay, so in our discussions about generics internally, obviously this came up that you can use it in that specific API version, and then it was pulled out within one release. And the reason is that basically those sharp edges that I was talking about, problems around how those how that specific generic type is enforced or type checked at both compile time and runtime are slightly inconsistent. So the model that was actually available back then has a lot of sharp edges, and like in the ideal world, that would actually work, but there's problems with the way that was implemented, which was why it was pulled out. So I wouldn't actually recommend going down that path if you can avoid it. And it's sort of part of the larger assessment we're doing of which path will we take generics and Apex.
Okay. Thank you very much. Another question from LinkedIn. When I pass an iterable ID to the in operator of a SQL query, I get the following error. In operator must be used with an iterable expression.
Well, my first statement is interesting. I did not know that was a problem. I mean, that's good to know that it's a problem. At surface level, that looks like it should work. It might be something to do with the way the SOCL is validating the expression. I would say please raise it on the Trailblazer community or send us a message and we can explore that a little bit more. I don't have the answer off the top of my head. It's an interesting problem.
Yeah,
So,
I'm actually itching to go and replicate this actually myself, because I know I created a bunch of iterables for Apex recipes last week. So I'm hoping that I can reproduce this actually.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Another question that's coming from Phil on YouTube. It will be very helpful for us to have a way to reevaluate a specific collection of formula fields instead of all, to make the processing as fast as possible, but still as object formula fields. This is more a suggestion than a
interesting.
question.
Oh, so first, hello, Phil. Um, so you want to only do a subset of the fields rather than all the fields. I see. I mean, what I can say is the formula eval and Apex might be able to help you in some degree of that, because you can be specific about which. The whole concept is you only load in what data you want and evaluate against that. So by design, it won't pull in additional data for you. That is probably currently the best path to explore for that sort of scenario. without us rebuilding the entire sort of formula engine and those other formula related functions in Apex. Happy to talk more about that, Phil, but yeah, we can explore that.
Yeah, I think
Thank
this
you.
is an interesting idea. It seems like a very interesting use case.
This is a question from Jeffrey on LinkedIn. Will there be any kind of helpers with the formula evaluation library? Thinking of things like syntax validation that could be called at build time for the admin building the formula.
So there's a couple of areas we're exploring there. Obviously, like an admin is familiar with the existing formula builder, so we're seeing what can be done to expose that as like a control that you might be able to use yourself to allow them to build these custom fields or to define the formula that you would run in Apex. That's one path we're running down. Another area we're looking at there is when you do the validation from the builder in Apex is we obviously give you back a bunch of information if the validation fails about syntax validation. And that's kind of a step that you could use in building your own components to say, here's my formula, you do the valuation and pass it back. There's also other things, helpers we're thinking of building. So say you evaluate a formula against a S object, you build a formula against an S object, you say, great, this formula works. And then your next question will be, well, if I need to run a SOQL query to go and get that account in the applicable fields to run that formula, what fields do I need? So one area we're exploring is having the formula builder expose a method that says, these are the fields on account you need to evaluate this specific formula. And that way you can just go and SOQL that object, get the data you need, and then run the formula. I mean, if there's other areas in there you're interested in, yeah, please let us know. But yeah, that's sort of something we want to come out from the dev preview of what else might you need to know about that formula when you validate it.
Okay, let's continue. Another question coming from LinkedIn. When deserializing the JSON, either a strict type is required or on type is a way around. Are there plans to introduce a midway deserialize method? Example, requirement is to parse some objects from JSON response as a string instead of object.
That yeah, that seems to be like a one of interesting use case. Um, Looking at this specific ask, I would probably try with data weave instead of like using the JSON serialize or something like that. Because with data weave, you can control things like you can say, okay, filter these objects for me, and then do the transformation only for this specific object. So that is one way I would approach it. I don't know, Daniel, if there is anything in the roadmap for making JSON serializer or deserializer to accept any sort of parameters or anything like that.
Not currently. We've had some discussion around generic support and deserialization, but no, not currently. Yeah, obviously exploring it, what you can do with data weave is like for that sort of transformation issue is probably a good first step.
Yeah, and also data will allow you to do the transformation from JSON to JSON itself. So that's the best part is like you can merge JSON. You can say, okay, I have all these JSON, just give me or convert this object JSON into a string. Those type of things are also possible within the within the data weave library. So I think this specific requirement can definitely be tackled with data weave in Apex. So I would probably explore that.
Good, thank you. I have another question here coming from LinkedIn by Jefferson. Will formula evaluation in Apex be considered as CPU time similar to JSON deserialize? If it is a big impact, it might make it less useful.
Yes, I mean, the short answer is we will count it towards your CPU evaluation time limit. The size of the impact as well, that's something that would be great for you to try out in the dev preview with your scenarios and say, does evaluating this formula, is it a significant CPU impact? We deliberately split out the validation building step of the formula so you can do that once and then just do the evaluation from a performance perspective, obviously to try and keep your CPU time down, um, to make the evaluation as streamlined as possible. But this is why we have a dev preview. We need you to try it out. Tell us, is it having a major CPU impact on you for you? We could look at to why that is. Um, it's something we need to explore. But yes, please try the dev preview.
Thank you. Another question coming from YouTube from Sharon. Why formula recalculate not accepting parent records?
I am not certain myself. I would. So is this? Oh, it's not clear. Is this formula the existing formula recalculation that we already support, or the new?
I
I'm
think it is
assuming
the
this is the existing.
yeah, this is the existing
Like
one.
if it's the existing one, it actually reaches off into the database to pull the required data. I don't know. I'd have to ask around to find out the specifics of that one.
Okay, thank you. Another question coming from LinkedIn. Are you working on the ability to do explicit commits in Apex such that you can do a call out after writing to the database?
No, would be the short answer. Sort of, we view, and it's to do with the rollback model in general. If something goes wrong with the transaction, we need to roll the entire transaction back. If you'd already done an explicit commit in the middle of the transaction, we can't do that. One area we are looking at exploring is, well, not exploring, we are working on and will be coming in a future release, is more flexibility around the database save points. Historically, if you created a save point, did some DML, rolled that save point back, and then wanted to do a call out, that was actually getting blocked, despite that the error message may imply that that was a possibility. So we've fixed that gap. So you can now create a save point, do your DML operation. If for whatever reason you need to roll back that save point, you will then be able to release it and then do a call out all within the same transaction. So that will give you some flexibility there, but generally, otherwise, no, the data, but like the Apex transaction is synonymous with committing the entire database transaction.
Okay, thank you. This is a question from Phil on YouTube. When will be when will we be able to perform a call out directly from an Apex trigger based platform event subscriber?
I will need to talk to the platform events team on that. That's a tricky one because obviously the trigger subscribers you get in Apex for a platform event, they behave in a very similar way to an Apex trigger, and so they naturally have that no callouts limitation. Does that make so much sense for a platform event where you're not really dealing with an existing DML statement? Probably not. I'll need to talk to them to see if we can explore why that's blocked, whether they just inherited it because it came from the existing trigger framework, and if there's any blockers. Part of the problem, like part of the reason it's generally better to pass that off to a queuable is we want that processing to be fast. So you can imagine if you've got thousands of platform events coming in, you don't want them all sitting and waiting to process while you do some call outs for a few hundred records. That's probably why the general pattern of passing those off to a queuable is preferable, just to ensure that the platform event can process the volume that's coming through. But we could explore it. I could ask them for further details.
Yeah, I think this is one of the definitely the popular asks from the community. I often see this question like, when are we be able to perform directly like an Apex call out from platform event based trigger? And I think
I'll revisit it with the platform events team to see if they have a specific reason, if they're open to the idea of allowing it. Yeah, just keeping in mind volumes is always an issue when you're dealing with something like a platform event. Lots of things going on.
Yep. Thank you very much. Let's go for the next one. This is a historical question. Why is Apex case insensitive?
That's a tricky one because it predates myself. I believe I can give you my assumption. I don't know if this is the real truth. I believe the assumption is it was to be as like sort of admin or friendly as to people who do like something like VBA, Visual Basic, which wasn't case sensitive, um, to make it as sort of a more accessible programming language. Um, Myself personally, I came from a C# background, so I liked case sensitivity. Um,
Yeah, one of
Generally,
the.
it works. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I had
Oh
something
no,
to
like
say.
if you had any, like I don't know the historic reason. My assumption is it was to make it more accessible to people. Like obviously, if you're not familiar with case sensitive programming, it's a little bit like weird. Why does this thing different from this thing just because the casing is different? Whereas if you came from a case sensitive background, it's like that is the assumption. I understand that these two things are different because their case is different.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was just going to share that I started learning JavaScript after doing Apex, and the first thing I started hitting was like writing everything, like assuming that JavaScript is also case insensitive, and JavaScript is case sensitive. So for developers, like full stack developers doing both Apex and LWC, I understand there is some sort of a mental hassle between
Mhm.
having to remember that, okay, JavaScript is case sensitive, right? Like the variable names are gonna be case sensitive, here is gonna be case sensitive, but for Apex, you can have a little bit of freedom. But yeah, I would say, like, for Apex, just stick with assume that it is case sensitive. That's what I typically tend to follow, is like, okay, let's assume that it is case sensitive, and not mix cases, and make life of other developers complex, because mixing the cases is going to make it harder to maintain code.
Yeah, I would say it's like a sort of a code maintainability, code good coding standard. Yeah, case sensitivity is probably something you want to maintain in your code, just as a practice. Yeah.
Thank you. We are getting closer to the end of this AMA. We have another question from Manoj on YouTube. We are now allowed to use text area long fields for filters in SQL. Can we expect this using some giving length or like operator in the future?
It's a tricky one because I'd have to take it to the SOCL team. I believe the restrictions on that are probably around how expensive that is to actually evaluate as a database query. I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to take it to them. Like if SOCL as a language supported it, then Apex would naturally support it. Um,
Did you,
I don't know.
Manoj, did you meant we are not allowed to, or we are now allowed to? I think it is not allowed to, I guess, at this point. Like,
Yeah,
can
I
you?
didn't think it would be allowed because, again, it's hard to translate that into a database query
Yeah,
because you can't build an index on a long text area field. Um,
yeah.
Okay, and this is the last question. This is also coming from YouTube, asked by Ike. Is there any plan for Apex to support functional programming paradigm like Java or other object-oriented programming languages like JavaScript? For example, having operations like array, map, filter, reduce, or some sort of a chaining?
this sort of comes back to, and it's similar to the response to when we were asked about Lambda expressions of we wanted to have a clear indication of where we were going with generics before we started building out additional language features on top of that, because whatever approach we take for generics will help shape those. So, like I know, like a map reduce or something is a common thing that people have asked for, and we wanted to see how that would fit with the generics implementation first. So we didn't really want to. Yeah, we need to get the generics sorted before we can sort out all the subsequent things that would flow on from that.
Yeah, and I like that the last question and the first question are pretty much similar in the stream. So the first question was like, why streams, right? Like we need streams. So I think the streams also, I kind of forgot about streams. Is like when you have streams in Java, and it's been a long time since I've like even played with Java, but I know that when you have streams in Java, you can do all these things like map, reduce, filter. So I think it all boils down to the same questions. And of course, with lambdas too, it's like it seems like a popular requested feature of giving ability to do streams and lambdas and functional programming.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Daniel and Mohit, for joining us on this Salesforce Developers AMA. We learn a lot about Apex and we have a good interaction with our audience. And looking forward to have you back on this show.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your feedback. I look forward to following up on some of those things and chasing down your feedback further. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, now we are done with the show. Remember to join the Salesforce Developer Group on the Trailblazer community and see you on the next one. Bye bye.